Welcome, everybody. My name is Alan Christy. I am the director of the Okinawa Memories Initiative and a professor in the Department of History at University of California, Santa Cruz. I want to welcome everybody to the second in the Okinawa Memories Initiative's series of events on the 50th anniversary of the reversion of Okinawa to Japan. Through this series of events, we're going to be thinking about the reversion, how it happened, what its implications were, both in political and cultural and also lived experience dimensions. And our first event took place in, I think it was December, with Professor Yoshikuni Igarashi of Vanderbilt University discussing his book, Japan 1972, which was an event to set the Okinawan reversion in its bigger temporal context, particularly in the media, in light of the media history of Japan. And tonight we're going to be talking about the reversion of Okinawa from the lens of politics, about the movement of Okinawans in favor of reversion, and about the negotiation and signing of the treaty and the implications of that. The Okinawa Memories Initiative, is a public humanities project, international public humanities project, and experiential education project that leads and employs undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty, staff, alumni, and members of the public in exploring the post-war history of Okinawa and the dramatic changes that the people of Okinawa and the people who are connected to Okinawa throughout the world, whether they are Okinawans in diaspora or people who have family members who have been to Okinawa, American veterans, servicemen, etc. It is a great pleasure to run this project with a talented group of people and dedicated students. I want to thank Edie Troutwine, the head of our events team, for putting the event together tonight, and the UC Santa Cruz special events people for hosting this event and making the technological platform for this all possible. I want to thank our two interpreters, Chio Mori and Nanako Komatsubara, for providing translation from English into Japanese. And now I'm going to say something in Japanese for our Japanese visitors. 通訳機能をお使いになりたい方は、ゾーン画面の下にある地球儀のアイコンを押して日本語を選んでください. So that's how, if you want to hear the Japanese language interpretation of the event, you can press on the Earth icon on the bottom of the Zoom screen and see it and hear that channel. Okay. Tonight we are joined by two special guests. We have Mike Mochizuki and Fumi Inoue. Dr. Mochizuki holds the Japan-U.S. Relations Chair in memory of Gaston Seeger at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Dr. Mochizuki was director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies from 2001 to 2005. He co-directs the Memory and Reconciliation in the Asia-Pacific Research and Policy Project of the Seeger Center. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He was also co-director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Policy at RAND and is taught at the University of Southern California and Yale University. He received his education at Harvard University. He has a number of publications, books such as the Japan-U.S. Alliance and China-Taiwan Relations, Implications for Okinawa, published articles in many publications such as the American Interest, Asia-Pacific Review, Foreign Affairs, Japan Quarterly, Journal of Strategic Studies, etc. And he is currently completing a book called A New Strategic Triangle, the U.S.-Japan Alliance and the Rise of China, while also co-editing a volume entitled Reconciling Rivals, War Memory, and Security in East Asia. Professor Mochizuki and I will be discussing the politics of the treaty negotiation and the international security arrangements between the United States and Japan and its impact on Okinawa in the second half of the program. But in the first half of the program, we will be joined by Dr. Inoue Fumi, or Dr. Fumi Inoue. Dr. Inoue received her PhD from Boston College in 2021. And the dissertation is titled The Politics of Extraterritoriality in Post-Occupation Japan and U.S.-Occupied Okinawa, 1952 to 1972. She will be talking with Dr. Dustin Wright, assistant professor at California State University, Monterey Bay, in the School of World Languages and Cultures. Dr. Wright is working on his own book on the history of post-war anti-base protest in Japan. So our program tonight will feature first a conversation between Dr. Inoue and Dr. Wright about the reversion movement. Then Dr. Mochizuki and I will be discussing the politics of the treaty itself, and then we'll be opening up some room to for conversation through the question and answer function on the Zoom window for the last third of the program. So without any further ado, I want to thank everybody for joining us here tonight, and I would like to invite Dr. Wright and Dr. Inoue to join us now.
Thank you very much, Alan. Yeah, and thanks to everybody for joining us today, and to everyone in Japan, good morning. Hi, Fumi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me as an invited speaker.
And you're joining us from Kyoto, is that right?
Yes, I am based in Kyoto now.
Great, well, welcome. Thank you very much. All right, let's jump into this, Fumi.
Okay. So shall I start sharing my slide. Okay, can you see? Everybody
we can see it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Let's start.
Thank you. Yeah, Fumi, I wanted to, your research and your recent dissertation looks a lot at social movements and sort of civil society and the ways that people on the ground were looking at Okinawan politics, the politics of reversion back to Japan in the 1950s and 1960s. And I thought maybe we could begin by thinking a little bit about, why reversion was on people's minds as a solution to something called the Okinawa problem. And I know that this is the focus of your project. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what does that mean, the Okinawa problem, excuse me, and why reversion might help solve that problem.
Yes, Dustin, thank you. So, so first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of this talk. So I wrote a dissertation on the history of US military criminal jurisdiction policies exercised in post-occupation Japan and Okinawa, and the dynamism of civil society responses to it. And I'm currently working on a book project on that subject. So I understand that my role is to consider in what ways like civil society actors ideas and actions matter in history with you all. And so my presentation is aimed for transnational public discussions. So this is my understanding of this event. And so let me start. And I have in my upcoming PowerPoint slides, you can see some books covers because I can cram so little in my presentation. I like you to look at those later if you are interested in them further details. So in order to understand why reversion became a solution to the so-called Okinawa problem for Okinawans, it is helpful and indeed crucial to have an overview of the trajectory of the locals' reversion movements and Japanese people's attitudes toward the Okinawa problem. To begin with Okinawan's reversion movement, it began before the establishment of the San Francisco system in 1952, which authorized Japan's recovery of sovereignty at the cost of the continuous occupation of Okinawa. So about 5 years after the Battle of Okinawa, Okinawan people are in limbo between Japan and the United States as the two empires who had competed over regional hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. US military elites who planned the Operation Iceberg positioned themselves as liberators for long-term US town basing in Okinawa. In the middle of, and especially in the immediate aftermath of the battle, because they wanted Okinawans to identify themselves as Ryukyuans, not Japanese. But the State Department, not to mention the Far Eastern Commission, did not oversee the occupation of Okinawa, and the military authorities began running the occupation regime via ad hoc and highly undemocratic measures, and military personnel's crimes and incidents were rampant, but the locals could not receive legal justice or compensation. So by 1951, the year Japan signed the peace treaty, Okinawan's discontent with the US occupation was so widespread that over 80% of the population, including those on small islands, called for immediate reversion to Japan. Okinawans did not have any representatives in Japan's parliament when it authorized the peace treaty. In fact, before the immediate emergence of this early reversion movement, some Okinawans with distinct political beliefs advocated for Okinawan's independence, claiming Okinawa's colonial relationship with Japan. But given information on the democratization of Japan and daily struggles arising from US occupation policies, and military personnel's instance most pressingly, this early reversion movement grew rapidly. And yet the movement faded soon after the institutionalization of the San Francisco system. And a local government called the Government of Ryukyu Islands, GRI, was established and had 3 branches of power, but the military government called the US Civil Administration of the Ryukyu Islands, or USCA, stood above it. For example, the locals needed permission from the USCA to publish newspapers and form a union. And especially in the years leading up to 1955, the USCA oppressed reversion movement by prioritizing what they defined as public welfare over liberal democratic principles. The prominent historian of Okinawa, Arasaki Morita, called the first half of the 1950s, or the period between 1952 and 1956, the darkest era in the history of the US occupation of Okinawa. But this political situation began to change in the mid-1950s when Okinawans' popular struggles against the US military's confiscation of native land and Japanese civil society's awakening to the so-called Okinawa problem came to resonate. Concerning Japan, before the mid-1950s, Okinawa was treated as a forgotten island by much of the population, to borrow the words of Time magazine correspondent Frank Gibney. Actually, Japanese media had reported on Okinawa occasionally, but not in any consistent and engaging way. But in 1954, a group of Japanese legal professionals affiliated with the Japan Civil Liberties Union began investigating the plight of occupied Okinawans, responding to a co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, Roger Nash Baldwin's letter requesting an inquiry into the US land seizure in Okinawa. So based on its 10-month investigation, the JCLU compiled a report titled Human Rights Problems in Okinawa. The impact of this report was enormous, especially in Japan, because the Asahi Shimbun gave special coverage of it, and the public repercussions prompted all political parties' engagement with the so-called Okinawa problem. And Okinawa newspapers began reporting on Japanese public debates over Okinawa. Further, the chief editor of the report, Ushitomi Toshitaka, called for international solidarity on occupied Okinawa in Calcutta, India, where Asian Jurist Conference was held in late January 1955 in the midst of the controversy. So given the emergence of this international political environment, Okinawa newspapers conveyed Japanese citizens and Asian countries' solidarity messages. Under military rule, however, Okinawan showed mixed reactions, some positive, others dismissive. Then in September 1955, the rape murder of a local girl, often called the Yumiko-chan incident, galvanized the islanders' unprecedentedly massive protests against GI crime and extraterritorial American military justice. This protest movement did not call for reversion to Japan, nor did it demand Okinawa's autonomy, but this supra-partisan protest movement demanded the application of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which declared the individual's right to life and equality before the law. So essentially, Okinawans demanded the occupied people's equality with those with national sovereignty. So building on this successful uprising, through which they secured the right to attend court-martial and receive official compensation for incidents committed by US military personnel, Okinawans mobilized a historic island-wide struggle called Shimagurumi Toso against the land seizure the following year. This island-wide struggle demanded official compensation for the seizure of native land and protested the deprivation of more land from the locals. This movement did not call for reversion to Japan. Some did, but not collectively. But it was evident that Okinawans were becoming more assertive and distancing themselves from the occupiers. And it was through this struggle that many Okinawans began reasserting their identity as Japanese. So by the mid-1950s, Okinawans began employing two strategies to improve their subaltern legal status. So one way was to appeal for universal human rights with internationalist philosophical foundations. The other way was to employ Japanese identity in their resistance to the occupiers by embracing and resorting to Japanese nationalism and solidarity movements. But ideological conflicts among themselves over how to achieve peace and how to grow the Okinawan economy continued dividing their collective resistance to the occupation. Although the island-wide struggle was successful in that the military eventually increased the compensation for the land seizure. Yet in the latter half of the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration's realignment of US armed forces and bases in Japan led to the deployment of more troops in Okinawa and more crimes involving the military and locals occurred. So a crucial turning point for the reversion movement came in the period between the late 1950s and early 1960s. Above all, a popular reversion movement grew out of the 1959 jet crash on Miyamori Primary School, which eventually killed 18 locals, most of whom were children. This enormously tragic incident did not trigger a massive reversion movement immediately, but the victims and grassroots organizations who organized a campaign for proper official compensation played a key role in establishing the famous Okinawa Prefectural Council for Reversion, or Fukkikyo, the largest organization dedicated to the cause of the reversion. In 1960, the Fukkikyo founders placed the protection of human rights and the adoption of the Japanese constitution in Okinawa at the heart of their pledge and pledged to maintain a separate-partisan front. As I have mentioned earlier, in the mid-1950s, Okinawans saw Japanese civil society's engagement with Okinawa, and ever since they had emphasized ethnic and cultural connections between Japanese and Okinawans. However, Japanese solidarity movement did not grow in the latter half of the 1950s due to the population's divided attitudes towards the American military presence and the Japan-US security relationship. And thus many Okinawans, including those who emphasized strong solidarity ties between Okinawan and Japanese activists, became concerned about Japanese civil society's developed understanding of the plight of Okinawa and the direction of the Japanese debate over the renewal of the Japan-US security treaty. virtually Japanese citizens' concern remained centered on Japan-centric peace and security. So what I need to emphasize here is that Japanese civil society's protest movement against the security treaty called the 1960 AMPO collectively demanded peace and popular sovereignty, but not respect for fundamental human rights, which is, as widely known, one of the 3 pillars of the Japanese constitution. In other words, they demanded their peace and popular sovereignty, but not the human rights of Okinawans and themselves. So witnessing the uneven trajectory of the American military presence in Japan and Okinawa, Okinawans decided to assert their demands even more vocally and collectively than ever before. And they came to believe that joining Japan was a solution to escape from their plight. Because Japan has the kind of constitution they wanted, and most human rights abuses they recognized resulted from the occupation regime. Conservative Okinawans did not join the Fukikyo immediately upon its foundation, but the membership of umbrella organizations grew exponentially in the first half of the 1960s. And in 1961, Okinawan activists founded Okinawa Human Rights Association, soliciting support from major local legal authorities and local newspapers and the head of Okinawan Teachers Association, which was a major driving force of social movements in Okinawa. The ACLU founders' visit to Okinawa in the aftermath of the 1959 jet crash was a critical event in that locals became increasingly aware of the power of human rights activism. That is, its ability to demand their rights on the global stage and maintain a popular front on the local level. So in the first half of the 1960s, human rights activism became deeply rooted in Okinawan society. And this popular human rights activism, which often called for the application of the Japanese constitution, reinforced the reversion movement. Going to the next slide. So what happened to the reversion movement in the years leading up to 1972? Reversion became a top agenda for the Japanese government when the Liberal Democratic Party Sato Eisaku became prime minister in 1964. By employing popular human rights activism, Okinawans gradually expanded the reach of their democratic rights in areas such as regulations on traveling, labor unions, and the press. And this new political situation gradually allowed more Japanese to visit the islands and strengthen their solidarity activism in the first half of the 1960s, but especially in the latter half. By the mid-1960s, the reversion movement became powerful enough to force Japanese policy elites to demand sovereignty over Okinawa as the lost territory in the war. And this political diplomatic move accelerated against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, which caused led to the highest number of GI incidents in the history of the occupation. In this climate, the reversion movement came to incorporate the locals' growing anti-base sentiment. Within the Fukikyo, the question of how to position themselves toward military bases became increasingly important, especially in the latter half of the 1960s. And eventually they decided to oppose them vocally. Indeed, they were frustrated with daily life struggles arising from bases, but also feared that the bases could be used for the war against the Vietnamese people. And they wanted that they would also become aggressors. Conservative Okinawans are also proposing plans to decrease the size of bases, but they were skeptical of the feasibility of immediate reversion to Japan, arguing that Okinawa was skeptical of the feasibility of immediate reversion to Japan. Arguing that Okinawa needed a higher level of economic growth before the reversion in order to secure its economic competitiveness and autonomy in relation to Japan and the US. So And the year 1968 was a remarkable year for Okinawa because they were authorized to hold the first democratic election of a GRI chief, and eventually Yarachobyo, a progressive candidate, took that position. Yara represented the population who opposed not only the occupation, but the American military presence per se. So this became an alarming situation for US and Japanese authorities who considered the US military presence on the islands was vital. So the rise of anti-base activism in Okinawa and Japanese solidarity activism, as well as their joint calls for a base-free Okinawa, became a real thing, and which US policy elites had feared most from the early occupation period. In 1969, the joint declaration by Sato and Nixon promised a nuclear-free homeland level reversion in 1972. Before then, Yara demanded the removal of American military bases. During his negotiations with Japanese authorities, but Japanese policy elites kept replying to him, bases on Okinawa would be a homeland level abstractly, and opposing bases entirely would jeopardize Japan's security with the US. As Professor Christy and Professor Mochizuki would discuss this topic with further details later, a nuclear-free homeland level reversion did not materialize.
If I could pause just for a moment there, and maybe just briefly think about transitioning to our next speakers, but I just want to maybe for folks who are listening, you know, reflecting a little bit on part of what you've been educating us about here is that, you know, I think that maybe many of the people listening, maybe some have heard of the AMPO protests of 1960, have a sense about what the US-Japan Security Treaty looked like, right? And we can all sort of imagine those major protests throughout the mainland of Japan. And for me, so much of what you're saying here that really resonates is just thinking about what a massive impact AMPO, or, you know, anti-AMPO protests mean for people in Okinawa, and how, you know, I think that maybe for sort of Japanese mainland focused discourse or political insight or history, it's often focused more on the mainland repercussions of those protests and you know, the Kishi, you know, forcing through the signing of the treaty and all of the tumult behind it. But the implications for that on Okinawa and the way that civil society in Okinawa was feeling the impacts of that, I think are really so useful for us to understand. So I'm really grateful that you're honing in on this moment for us in a really important way.
Thank you for jumping in. Yeah, I was almost concluding my talk. Yeah, apologize. Yeah, but
no, I'm sorry.
Sharing your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I might suggest, I think, you know, when we're going to have a Q&A in shortly, and you know, maybe folks out there, you know, would want to hear more about, you know, your thoughts on what did civil society think more about reversion? You know, what was the on the ground nature of reversion? Like, what was the impact of that? You know, I know that which all is within your research scope. So I think maybe, but perhaps given the time, maybe we should transition over to our next speaker. Thank you so much, Fumi, for kicking this off and getting this conversation going. Yeah, is there anything else before we transition that we should know at this point?
No, thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I ran out of time.
No, you didn't. This is great. Thank you for these this material, and I think we can share links to those to the readings that you have suggested for us. We can share those in our social media feed so that people can access those. Okay, so don't go anywhere from me. We want you back for the Q&A.
Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Fumi, if you wanted to just wrap up, because it looks like you're at the very end here, that would be fine, but we can also come back to that in the Q&A afterwards. How do you feel best about it?
Yes, we could. Yes, yeah, I would like to join your discussion later. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll come back to that at the end there. So great. Thank you very much for that great talk. And Professor Mochizuki, thank you again for joining us here today. It's really an honor to have a chance to talk with you.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, before we leap into things, I wonder if you could say something quickly. I'm going to give you a chance to plug your library at your institution.
Yes, well, thank you for that opportunity, Alan. And I see the librarian who's in charge of our Okinawa collection at the Gelman Library at George Washington University is also attending this webinar. With the generous support of the Okinawa prefectural government, we established the Okinawa collection at George Washington University. And the purpose of this collection is to collect secondary and primary material about contemporary Okinawa and its history. I know that the foremost collection on Okinawa outside of Japan is at the University of Hawaii, and we had no intention of trying to eclipse that collection, but we really wanted to focus on the contemporary aspects of Okinawa, including the base issue, the military base issue, reversion, the Battle of Okinawa, and the sort of work that Dr. Inoue is doing about civil society. So, this has been a great resource for the wider policy community in the Washington, D.C. area.
Yeah, I say the more the better, right? This is, I was very happy to hear about the establishment of the library there. So that's great. Well, you and I were going to be talking about the negotiation of that reversion treaty. And of course, Dr. Inoue gave us the term, the San Francisco system at the beginning, which is kind of the place that I wanted to start, because when I think about the negotiation of that reversion treaty, my first thought would be Okinawa is a place where the American military from 45 to 72 has full freedom of action. They don't need to consult with a host country about how they're going to be using the bases or deploying their forces or whatnot. And at the reversion treaty, which comes into effect in 1972, is the negotiations are happening during the Vietnam War. The Cultural Revolution is happening in China. So China must have looked like it was fairly unstable. The Korean Peninsula is still a place of high tension. So, and the San Francisco system was built to address that kind of thing. Would you say?
Yes, exactly. I think to really understand the government-to-government negotiations regarding the reversion of Okinawa, you have to look at the strategic context at the time. And in many ways, the San Francisco Peace Treaty provides the prologue to this reversion negotiation process. And I would say it's the prologue because when the peace settlement was being negotiated between Tokyo and Washington, even the conservative government in Japan wanted Okinawa returned. I mean, this was a very big issue for them. And I think John Foster Dulles felt that this could be a deal breaker, but the U.S. military wanted to hang on to Okinawa. And so what John Foster Dulles came up with is this very vague concept about residual sovereignty, that the United States recognizes the residual sovereignty of Okinawa, of Japan over Okinawa. And it wasn't clear what that meant in practice, because in practice, the United States had control over Okinawa, but it was enough to kind of placate the Yoshida government to sign the peace treaty. But the negotiation process really begins in the 1960s, which Fumi laid out quite nicely. And I would say that it follows kind of three phases. The first phase is the early 1960s when Ikeda was prime minister and John F. Kennedy was the US president. And here, I think Ambassador Edwin Reichar played a pretty important role in convincing President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy about the importance of the reversion of Okinawa. And so as a result of that, President Kennedy publicly states the ultimate objective of returning Okinawa. So that's when we move from residual sovereignty to the goal of returning Okinawa. And then I would say the next phase is the period of President Johnson and Prime Minister Sato, in which the really the negotiations, the conversation at the working level between the U.S. government and the Japanese government starts. And I'll talk about, we can talk about this later about their mindset. But on the U.S. side, Richard Snyder, who is the Japan country director in the State Department, and a very young but brilliant policymaker and policy analyst, Morton Halperin, is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. And so Schneider and Halperin are leading the Ryukyu Islands Working Group that is trying to come up with the U.S. position on Okinawa reversion. And then on the Japanese side, the Japan team is headed up by Togo Fumihiko, the Director General of the North American Bureaus of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then in addition to the North American Affairs Bureau, you have the Treaties Bureau involved in this. And there's a young diplomat named Mr. Kuriyama, who is involved in this. Mr. Togo later becomes ambassador to the United States, and then Mr. Kuriyama becomes ambassador to the United States. So that's kind of the working team. And then the final phase is the period of the Nixon administration, and Sato is still prime minister. And then this is where you get the controversial secret agreement upon nuclear weapons. But the other important piece is the way the United States handles the Senkaku Island issue.
So a number of things come to mind when you've given me those three stages. And I think about, for example, domestic American politics. We're going from 2 Democratic administrations to a Republican administration, right? And also, of course, when we're thinking about the American side, we've got the civilian government led by the president, who's also the commander in chief. And of course, Okinawa has a governor general who is always the army. Am I right?
Oh, right.
And so you've got a military that's got a vested interest in that, in their presence in the island. So were there tensions? Was it hard to get to an agreement on simply the American side before even going to the negotiations with the Japanese on what this reversion would mean?
Yes. Yeah, so there are tensions, divisions within the United States, but there is also tensions on the Japanese side. And I think that the divisions and the tensions on both, in both the United States and Japan then shapes the negotiating process and then ultimately the outcome. And so on the US side, there's a fundamental division between the civilians and the uniformed military. And the civilians, primarily led by the State Department, but supported by Ambassador Reischauer, sees that it's really important to move forward on Okinawa reversion in order to prevent another crisis in bilateral relations like the one that happened in 1960 that right. Dustin and Fumi talked about. And in fact, Professor Reischauer, who was a professor of Japanese at Harvard University, is tapped to become ambassador because the Kennedy administration is quite impressed by an article that he wrote reflecting on the 1960 security treaty crisis. I believe it was called The Broken Dialogue, and it was published in Foreign Affairs. And he basically said that the United States really needs to be sensitive to what's going on in Japanese politics. And he felt that if there wasn't move on Okinawa reversion, this would provide another issue around which Japanese civil society could kind of mobilize an anti-American, anti-security treaty, pro-neutralism type of movement. And the civilians, and including Ambassador Wright, believed, and I don't know to what extent they were aware of the sorts of information Fumi uncovered, but they came to the conclusion that Okinawans consider themselves to be Japanese and they wanted to go back to Japan. And so they were supporting reversion. But the military, on the other hand, just was adamant against this. They thought that they fought and died and Okinawa is theirs. They needed to maintain control over Okinawa, given the important security challenges that the United States faced, not only in Korea, but in Southeast Asia, with the escalating conflict in Vietnam. And so they thought that the US military assets and bases in Okinawa was fundamentally important for US military strategy, and they did not want to let go of Okinawa. So you had this conflict between these two camps. And so what emerged out of this conflict was a kind of a fragile consensus behind the following approach, that the United States would transfer the administrative rights or the sovereign rights over Okinawa back to Japan. But in that transfer, the United States would try to maximize its ability to freely use Okinawa for military deployments and operations. And so that mindset is what animates the US side in negotiating with the Japanese. Now, on the Japanese side, there's a different sort of tension. There's a tension between the Japanese foreign policy community, primarily the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also leaders of the Conservative Liberal Democratic Party. Here, the Japan Defense Agency is relatively weak, so they're not a big player. So there's that view of the foreign policy community. And then there's the view at the civil society level that Fumi talked about. And there's a fundamental tension here. So the foreign policy community is concerned about the security relationship with the United States. They want to satisfy as much as possible the American expectations about the use of Okinawa for the military. And the fear is that if they didn't kind of move towards satisfying the American expectation, then the United States would not value Japan as an ally and would not want to defend Japan against possible threats. And this concern really increases after what some people call the Johnson shock, and that shock is, I remember it well when he announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election as president, and he was about to move to reduce U.S. troops in Vietnam, and the Japanese foreign policy community thought that the United States was now pulling out of Asia. So they wanted to show that Japan was a good security partner of the United States for strategic relations, for strategic interests. But at the popular level, in Japan, there was a brewing kind of anti-military, anti-base, anti-nuclear sentiment that was beginning to link up with the Okinawa reversion sentiment. And so any kind of negotiations with the United States had to resonate with that constituency. And that put them in a dilemma. And so how did the Japanese government deal with this? Well, I think the way they dealt with it is to kind of have this gap between the public rhetoric on the one hand and the secret negotiations with the United States on the other. So publicly, they wanted to demonstrate that they were very sensitive to the civil society pressure. And the key issue became that when Okinawa was returned to Japan, it would be returned without nuclear weapons. In other words, it would be like the main islands of Japan.
Abiding by the three non-nuclear principles.
By the three non-nuclear principles.
Right.
But the United States was insisting, given the precarious security environment, that if there was an emergency, they wanted to be able to store nuclear weapons on Okinawa and redeploy them. And so there was this gap. And Prime Minister Sato, although he himself was for Japan developing nuclear weapons, he had boxed himself into a corner by accepting the three non-nuclear principles, for which he gets the Nobel Peace Prize later on, but he really didn't believe in that. But he was a pragmatic politician, and he understood how this was so important. And so then the outcome is that Japan makes a secret agreement with the United States that would reassure the United States that they would allow the redeployment of nuclear weapons back into Okinawa during an emergency, while getting the United States to publicly state that they are removing the nuclear weapons from Okinawa when Okinawa reverted back to Japan. So that's the way the Japanese dealt with this tension between their strategic interests on the one hand and the pressure they were feeling from civil society, in both in Japan and in Okinawa.
It's a good illustration of what I like to think of the three non-nuclear principles as having a fourth one. So it's do not produce, do not hold, and do not allow the introduction of. Is that right?
Right.
Nuclear
so
weapons.
those are the three.
And then for me, the fourth one is don't ask, don't tell. Because of course, it's American policy never to confirm the location of nuclear weapons, right? So you could ask the Americans, are there nuclear weapons on this aircraft carrier? But they're not going to get an answer. Is that right?
Right. Well, this got Professor Reischauer into trouble, and so this happened when I was a graduate student, and I was a student of Professor Reischauer, and he kind of revealed in a newspaper interview that there was in fact an understanding that nuclear weapons could transit through Japanese ports, and this went against the Japanese government statements in the National Diet, and this really embarrassed the Japanese government. And so I remember one Japanese leader in the Diet representing the government basically said that Professor Reischauer must be senile. There was no such understanding, but he's been completely vindicated after these secret agreements were revealed, because one of the secret agreements was that Japan agreed that the United States could redeploy nuclear weapons back into Okinawa under an emergency, and the other secret agreement is that the third principles did not mean that U.S. Nuclear carrying ships could not transit through Japanese ports.
Yeah, one of the best sources I think for it's a good read for a popular audience on this whole thing is Wakai Izumi's book, The Best Course Available. Am I right? I mean, reading that and seeing the language that Henry Kissinger and he were using to talk to each other about the negotiations that are coming up is a fascinating window into what these negotiations look like.
Yes. There's been quite a bit of a lively discussion or debate about how important was the role of Professor Wakai Izumi, and I certainly think that he played a key role in a couple of moments. One was during the Johnson administration, and what's interesting about Sato is that although he did rely upon the foreign ministry, he didn't completely trust the foreign ministry to do everything that he wanted, and so he liked to use personal envoys, and so he tapped Professor Wakai Izumi, and so I think Professor Wakai Izumi played kind of two key roles. One was during the Johnson administration, when Professor Wakaizumi goes to the White House and meets the National Security Advisor, Walt Rostov. What Sato was interested in was trying to get the United States to make a firm commitment for the return of Okinawa. And he understood that that was a very ambitious goal. So he proposed kind of a two-step process. First, get the United States to publicly state the principle of Okinawa reversion, and then later the date of reversion. But then the other key role is negotiating some way of narrowing the gap between the United States and Japan on the nuclear issue. And this was such a sensitive issue that I think Prime Minister Sato again turned to Professor Wakaizumi to kind of put together that deal.
I could honestly talk about this with you for hours. And of course, that would test the patience of everybody who's joined us here tonight. And of course, you who are on the East Coast at a much later time of the night. But I want to make sure that we touch on two more things that I think are really interesting about this. And one of them will definitely point to an ongoing issue that comes from the reversion. And I think when we get back to the roundtable, we should also continue to address those. But one of the things that's interesting in the Wakaizumi account of things is that the role that the textiles issue played, right? And the textiles issue was an issue for obviously for President Nixon in 1968 and looking toward his reelection in 1972. And of course, the textile issue turns out to have been a bigger issue than I had originally first thought of it as when I was speaking with you earlier on, because it ends up involving the Senkaku Islands. Right. So you say a little bit about that, please.
Yeah. So it's really kind of an amazing story because, well, one, while the Okinawa Reversion Agreement is being negotiated, the Republic of China on Taiwan really starts to protest and petition to the Nixon administration that basically what the Japanese call the Senkakus, or the Diaodao in Chinese, belongs to the Republic of China. So it's the sovereignty issue, but they also are claiming the rights to the continental shelf because of the discovery of oil and gas deposits in the East China Sea. And then there's also a fishing dispute, and Taiwan fishermen are being very aggressive in fishing in those waters. So this is really creating tension between two treaty allies of the United States, and the United States is caught in the middle. And this is happening again at a very delicate time when the Nixon administration is beginning to think about rapprochement with the People's Republic of China.
Right.
And then the textile issue comes on top of that. And the United States and the Republic of China on Taiwan are in the middle of discussions about textiles. President Nixon really wants Taiwan to make concessions on textiles, wants Taiwan to restrain its exports of textiles to the United States, just like the United States pressured Japan to do that. But then Taiwan says, well, what about the Diaoyu Islands? And so at the very last minute before the reversion agreement is going to be signed, one of his cabinet members in the next administration begins to have this conversation with Taiwan and throws kind of the possibility of delaying the reversion agreement until Taiwan concedes on the textile issue. And so at this final moment, it looks like this whole thing might not go through. And this is a decision that Richard Nixon makes, and he decides to go ahead with the reversion agreement. But what the United States decides to do is to remain neutral on the sovereignty question, but basically says that we administered Okinawa, and Senkaku was part of Okinawa. We don't know, we don't have a position on the sovereignty issue. We hope that this can be resolved between the contested, the conflicting parties, or by a third party arbitration. But we would just transfer the administration of the Senkakus to Japan. Now, the Republic of China was unhappy about it, but it leads to this very strange position that we have today, that we argue that the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty applies to the Senkakus, but we take a position of neutrality on the sovereignty dispute between Japan on the one hand and the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China on Taiwan on the other hand. And this is, I would say, one of the reasons why we now have these tensions in the East China Sea.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And of course, you know, this is one of those moments as well where we have to recognize that there's that other dimension of American domestic politics, which is Nixon is really concerned about the textile issue, because some of the states that he's really trying to court are places where the textile issue is really salient.
Right. It's part of the Southern strategy.
Right.
You know, to turn the Democratic base in the South, the solid South, into the Republican camp, and the textile issue was a key issue for that.
Yeah, so many interesting legacies. Well, so the reversion goes through, and as we know, the movement in Japan, particularly someone like Yara Chobyo, is very disappointed with the outcome of the treaty, right? And one of the things, of course, is that there had been an expectation that there would be a reduction of the base presence in Okinawa, but in fact, it increased in the aftermath of the signing of the treaty. Is that correct?
Right. Or well, it definitely didn't go down, and it increased for an interesting reason, because in the context of the Vietnam War, the Marines in Okinawa go to Vietnam, so they're not in Okinawa from 65 to 69, and so many in Okinawa who wanted a reduction of the U.S. military presence when the United States was beginning to withdraw from Vietnam, you know, they thought, well, those forces would go back to the United States. But in November 1969, you know, what happened is that the U.S. 3rd Marine Division leaves Vietnam, but then goes to Okinawa, and then this becomes what is now known as a 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, and the aviation unit for that force is there in Futenma, you know, which is the centerpiece of the current tensions between Okinawa Prefecture on the one hand and the central government of Japan and the United States on the other. So
that will be their airfield at Henoko that's being constructed now. Is that correct?
Right. So the United States has agreed to return Futenma, but the precondition for returning Futenma, which is located in heavily a densely populated area in Ginowan City, but the precondition is that another facility, another air facility would be constructed in Okinawa, and that's and the site of that is Henoko.
So let me ask you one more question, because one of the other things that happens after the reversion treaty, and I'm not clear on the timeline in this, so I'm wondering if you can help me with this, is of course that the self-defense forces also begin to station units and machinery and whatnot. SDF bases open up in Okinawa as well. Can you say something about that process? When did it start? And, you know, was that understood to be part of the treaty itself, or is that simply a decision that the SDF could make on their own?
Yes, right. So it's not part of the treaty, but in the backdrop of the negotiations for the treaty, the the United States over and over, and Secretary of Defense McNamara was very vocal in this, is that Japan has to become more of an ally. Japan needs to do more for its own defense. The Japanese government needs to educate the Japanese public about the importance of security, about the importance of the U.S.-Japan security relationship, and the importance of the self-defense force. And so in that context, Japan begins to deploy self-defense forces into Okinawa. But still, it was a pretty modest force, but they got located in Naha, and so it's a very crowded air facility. It's a civilian airport. And so that's where they are. And so some people make the argument that the reason why the Japanese government is banking the construction of the 2 runways at Henoko is that eventually the self-defense force would want to use those facilities.
Mm-hmm.
But the other tragedy of Okinawa is that after reversion, not only has the U.S. footprint in Okinawa, hasn't declined that much, but the strategic situation has become more severe, in part because of tensions over the Senkaku Islands, but also the saliency of the Taiwan issue. And so not only the United States, but Japan too sees the military importance of the Southwest Island chain of Okinawa. And so rather than reducing the military presence, what you're now seeing is an expansion of the military presence on the part of the United States as well as Japan.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. If I have one more question immediately, it's really speculative. The trajectory in the longer term for the SDF in Okinawa then is, if this current situation continues, is to see the SDF continue to even possibly expand or certainly secure their position in Okinawa because of its importance.
Right. Yeah, so in a sense, the worst case scenario for Okinawa is that you see an increase in the self-defense force presence and no decrease in the U.S. military presence, or even an increase. And so then what you have is the net increase. I think one possible path forward is that as Japan begins to assume more of a role for its own defense, especially over the Southwest Island chain, that Japan could then tell the United States that we can fulfill this mission and we feel pretty secure, and so that the United States can begin to decrease its military presence in Okinawa. And then the other argument that could be made is, given the modernization of Chinese military capabilities that makes all of Okinawa so vulnerable to Chinese missile attacks, is to say to the Americans that you don't want to concentrate so many of your military assets in Okinawa. You should disperse them outside of Okinawa at a minimum, maybe even beyond Japan. And so that might be a way of reducing the U.S. military presence. And so then the question is, will the people of Okinawa be more willing to tolerate the Japanese military presence, the presence of the self-defense force, because there might not be as many incidents between the self-defense force and the local population as there is between the U.S. military and the local population.
Right. Well, thank you for that fascinating discussion. As I say, you can tell I keep wanting to ask questions, but we do have questions in the Q&A. So we're going to go ahead and open those up, and welcome back, Dustin and Fumi, if we can. And let me start with a question from Burns Yamashita. One of the lesser talked about sides of the bases issue is the tremendous economic impact of the US bases. The Japanese government pays many millions of dollars to Okinawan landowners in leases, and many thousands of Okinawans earn their living from the US military presence, either as MLC employees or contractors, suppliers. These benefactors are a kind of silent group that is not covered much in the press and other media. Could someone please comment on how this aspect affects the country-to-country relationship, if it does at all?
Well, I'll take an initial stab at this, and Fumi knows much more of the local situation, so maybe she can add to that. Yes, there is kind of a conventional view out there that the U.S. military presence is such an important part of the Okinawan economy. One in terms of the rent that is being paid to the landowners, but also the employment. And certainly it has played a role. But I think what's happened over the last decade or so is that not only is there a limit to how much the U.S. military presence contributes to the local economy, but the fact that the United States has so much of the real estate controlled by the military, it makes it very hard for Okinawa to develop and to realize its full potential. So maybe in the short run, it may look like the U.S. military presence contributes to the Okinawan economy, and I won't deny that it doesn't. But if you're thinking of further development, I think the consensus in Okinawa is that it now serves as an obstacle. And so that's why both conservatives and progressives in Okinawa want the United States to, at a minimum, return all of the bases kind of south of Kadena, which is the most heavily populated area of the main island of Okinawa.
Right. I mean, I think about something like the Shintoshin area in North Naha as one of those places that was a former base related land.
Right.
And returned to Okinawa, and is has clearly been developed as a place that's meant to be part of the economic engine of the area, right? With lots of retail of varieties and whatnot. And then I think about in here, if any of you can help, is it around Camp Foster that there's that large amount of land that's being returned now that I believe was going to be developed for a health research site?
Right. And then there are also some areas that have already been returned and then is kind of developed into a tourist area.
I happen to have open right now. I was looking earlier this week at the Okinawa Prefectural Office on base issues. I'm looking at some of their recent research, and that area that you're talking about, Alan, Shintoshin and Naha, they calculate that the economic output of that area that was returned has increased 32 times since that land was returned, and the population of employed people working in that area increased by 93 times since that part of Naha was returned. So, from the prefectural government's perspective, there's lots of these examples that the government has compiled about, the economic value. Clearly their position there is that the economic value is much greater when it's not a base. Yeah.
So this next question is a good one for Fumi. It has to do with civil society. So from Leonardo Fontes, usually when I read about reversion, the civil pressure for reversion comes in the form of public protests, riots, or petitions from civil groups. But did the GRI have a direct dialogue with Tokyo as well? I'm not sure if you or Professor Mochizuki has a. Go ahead, Fumi.
Yes. So yeah. So I do think that so Okinawa studies, scholars argue that Japan-U.S. Those who study Japan-U.S. Security relationship don't neglect the agency of Okinawan political leaders, and so I agree with you that it has been, Okinawan GRI, leaders negotiation with Japanese authority has not been studied much, but Komatsu Hiroshi has written a very good article about Yara's negotiation with Japanese authorities in 1969. He argues that so Yara tried to ask really what homeland level meant, and as Professor Mochizuki discussed earlier, they wanted to have this vague image of reversion as much as possible to, and the Japan-U.S. so far has established Japan-U.S. a joint committee that has produced a lot of confidential agreements, including the ones on the nuclear weapons and etc. On U.S. foreign criminal jurisdiction policy. So they wanted to have this vague image of homeland level reversion, but Yara tried to elaborate on that, and he was successful in that. Basically, Japanese leaders had to actually had to admit that so bases would not be reduced immediately, and yeah. So in any case, I would recommend you to consult with Komatsu's work.
So Fumi, did he also then, was he able to really engage with the Japanese civil society, not just government to government, but to increase the pressure from the civil society side on this question of Hondonami?
Yara's engagement with Japanese civil society.
Yeah.
I believe he did. He was he was a product of social movement. He was the head of Okinawa Teachers Association, which was the biggest driver of social movements in Okinawa. So he was always engaging with social movements. But he also wanted to represent all Okinawan people who had different ideas as to ideas about the timing of reducing bases from Okinawa. So, but he was engaging with Japanese civil society as well.
Well, this is also a good opportunity for me, because your the last part of your talk was going to be addressing the Koza uprising and other protests at that moment around the determination of reversion. So what would you like to contribute to this answer in terms of that discussion?
So you mean, okay.
Yeah, your last slide was was discussing things like the Koza uprising and all, right?
Yes.
This was thinking about the reversion from the ground, basically, right?
So yes, so my interpretation of Koza riot or uprising, which is hundreds of Okinawans' destruction of U.S. military vehicles that happened in 1970, is that I think it really represented the penetration, like tension between the penetration of violence in Okinawa and the penetration of human rights activism in Okinawa. I think they both exploded at the same time. So as Franz Fanon argued, in a colonial setting, violence becomes the language. So, and I, when I was doing research in Okinawa, I've seen a lot of newspaper articles on, gruesome crimes that were committed during the time of the Vietnam War, while taxi drivers, ear was cut, and etc. So, to some extent, those people who participated in, the Koza uprising, were, internalizing violence in their daily lives. But at the same time, because they, they demanded, they, call for, their equality with those with national sovereignty, Japanese people, American people, respect, for fundamental human rights. That's why they couldn't kill, any GIs, and that's why they limited the use of force. It's some, and that was the, I think, yes, political atmosphere, like, yes, that's where they were politically in the early 1970s.
Thank you. Our next question from Kathy Foley: the annexation of Okinawa was only in 1879. Was there ever political impetus to make the island independent? I understand that getting the US out was and is major, but one gets the feeling of Japan using Okinawa for its own purposes, not all that different from Korea or Taiwan. Was everyone happy to go back to Japan? So this is also a good question for Fumi, I think, but all of us can speak to this. So we start with that last question. What more can you say about the popular sentiment in Okinawa once reversion went into effect?
So, people had, I'm sorry, I couldn't read the questions, but, people had, mixed attitudes toward it. There was the rise of anti-reversion, movement, although it was a small group. But they, so both the, strong progressive movement and anti-reversion movement were critical of the Japan-US security relationship. But this small group argued that joining Japan would mean, joining the, this Japan-US security relationship, which would continue exploiting Okinawa. And those who are in the, bigger progressive movement are also critical of that. And they, but they still thought that reversion would be an answer to it. But there is a confidential agreement between Japan and the US that commits Japanese authorities to waive criminal jurisdiction over crimes committed by off-duty military personnel, and one controversial incident happened in that year. So Okinawan's law, and so far as the US military did not refuse to, refuse to give custody of the GI, and so Okinawans protested, and they immediately learned what it meant, really meant for, like, meant for them to, join this regime, which, yes, as they feared.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, of course, Professor Mochizuki and I were talking about this in terms of larger strategic questions, and a lot of this can be framed in terms of the presence of the bases and the risk of war, right, or the contribution to peace. But for example, when you bring up things like issues related to the status of forces agreement, the SOFA agreements, and who has jurisdiction over what personnel and what times of activity is of course a crucial element of all of this, right? And that's one of the ways that civil society particularly feels the legacy of the reversion as having a constant impact in daily life, right? So yeah, do you have anything to add to that, Professor Mochizuki?
Yeah, I guess what I would add is that when I talk with intellectuals and policymakers in the conservative camp in Tokyo, I get surprised because they often fear a Okinawa independence movement, and I get surprised by that because I don't sense a strong independence movement, but there seems to be a fear that if Tokyo is not more responsive to the wishes of the Okinawa people, such a movement could actually emerge, and maybe that's a possibility. And when I read about the history of Puerto Rico, and I realized that there was a real radicalized independence movement in Puerto Rico, certainly could happen in Okinawa. My sense is that there's a profound disappointment with reversion. So I see a question in the chat about celebrating the reversion in Okinawa. And I'm not sure, I haven't been to Okinawa since the pandemic, so I don't know, I can't get a sense of the mood of Okinawa Prefecture. But I'm not sure that there's going to be fireworks and a lot of celebration about reversion. I think it's more of a moment of reflection and disappointment, because I think they thought by going back to Japan, Japan would take care of Okinawa and actually reduce the US military presence in Okinawa, and that has not happened. But what I see is a call for greater regional autonomy. And the one professor, who's quite close to the current governor, Deni Tamaki, is Professor Shimabukuro Jun, who's a professor of public administration. And he has written widely about regional autonomy, and he's referred to the Scottish model as a possible way of thinking about Okinawa's future. So even while being part of Japan formally, that Okinawa would have greater autonomy regarding policies within Okinawa. So I think that voice has some traction. Now, if there's further disappointment, I can imagine that there could be a radicalization of views in Okinawa, and there might be some who might say, well, we're for independence. But right now, I just see that there are people who make that argument, but it's still a pretty marginal movement.
My first trip to Okinawa was in 1992 in May on the 20th anniversary, and I remember going to some commemorative events, and more somber, and that was pre-1995 rape incident, which of course made things so much more tense. But I was also thinking Sasuga Mochizuki sensei, because I was trying to remember Shimabukuro's name, because I don't have my books near me, but I was thinking, I've had conversations, I remember in 2013, with people who are saying, there are proposals for, governmental revision in Japan that would move toward a more federal system that would be one of the ways to create more regional autonomy. And so, I mean, that's a whole topic that one could go into for quite a long time. Another fascinating question.
I'll say, when I met the former governor Ota Masahide and interviewed him in 2010, and at that time he mentioned something really similar to me. He had done a Fulbright in Arizona when he was a younger person, and that's where I'm from. So we sort of bonded over that, and he was telling me that that he wished that Japan could adopt a kind of federal system in some way, so that Okinawa would have more of an ability to govern its, to sort of govern itself slightly more independently, kind of like the Scottish model that, Professor Mochizuki is referencing here. Yeah. So it seems to be a trend.
Cameron Vanderskoff asks about, in Okinawa, the question of U.S. bases and American impact is an unavoidable one, both 50 years ago and today. In the U.S., however, most people today know little or nothing about Okinawa or a military presence there. It's comparatively invisible in our politics. So he wonders if any of the speakers could expand on the role or lack thereof of the American public in the reversion process, and what that meant compared to the roles of the Okinawan and Japanese publics at the time. Are there any lessons from that era, like any ties with anti-Vietnam War protests or broader racial justice and decolonial movements that might have relevance for activating popular American awareness and engagement today with issues in Okinawa? Professor Mochizuki, I think of the regular trips to Washington, D.C. of Okinawa prefectural government officials, from the governor to others, about trying to find ways to engage with the American public on this stuff, right?
Right, and so Governor Denny Tamaki is very much emphasizing that, and I think what Okinawa leaders are trying to find is a language that will resonate with Americans, and I think Governor Onaga, who preceded Governor Tamaki, was also searching for that. And the language I think that they've been promoting is one about environmental rights, and that resonates among Americans, especially in civil society. And so, kind of the environmental impact of the U.S. military presence in terms of toxic substances, or the impact that it has on the natural life of the oceans, the beautiful oceans, waters around Okinawa, and that's been, that's resonated in the protest movement against the STEM replacement facility in Henoko. So I think there's a certain amount of traction. But I would say, on the whole, unfortunately, Americans aren't aware of the reach of, in a sense, the American empire. I just recently read a book called "How We Hide the Empire." Right, and so we have the logo United States, which is the continental United States, but we forget about the possessions, the territories, all the dots all around the world that the United States controls. And given the status of forces agreement, you could say that although the administrative rights and sovereignty of Okinawa returned to Japan, if you look at then all of the different dots of the U.S. military facilities, the United States has sovereignty over that. But Americans aren't aware of that because Americans have this illusion that we are not an imperial country, and that we basically are there with the 48 states on the continent of the United States, and then there's Alaska, and then maybe Hawaii, and then we forget about the rest. And so I think that's the difficulty that Okinawans have in trying to get traction in the United States, because it's the United States that has a distorted image of itself.
I was thinking, when you're talking about the environmental impact and the ways that sometimes events do matter, and I what's happening at the Red Hill bulk fuel storage facility in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii is, to use the word interesting feels wrong, violent, but the damage that's being done there, and the scale of political issue that's becoming, strikes me as one of those ways where, if I were on the Okinawan side trying to press that environmental impact issue, I would be pointing to the Red Hill facilities as well, because of course this is what has been happening in Okinawa for a long time. I often will amaze students with the gesture to the public bath next to Kadena that caught fire kind of thing, and that's one of many of those kinds of incidents. So interesting thoughts on that. We're at 6 o'clock. I'm going to ask one more question because there's just one left here in the line. Again, Fumi, I think this is something that I'd love to hear from you on, and that's back from Leonardo Fontes, again, wanting to jump on the very first question. Given the degree of economic dependence with U.S. bases during the occupation years, was there a significant section of Okinawan society that was opposed to reversion, or at least to a U.S. drawback? And if yes, were there clashes with the pro-reversion groups? So to what degree was Okinawan civil society divided between pro and anti-reversion sentiments?
So yes, that's a big question. So I would just talk about Eisenhower's 1960 visit to Okinawa. It was a very, can I say, it was the, it happened in the aftermath of the 1959 jet crash I talked about earlier. So the victims of the 1959 jet crash victims and their families held a big protest in March to Naha City and held a big rally calling for reversion. And Okinawans are becoming more assertive, and so some had red flags, and also other people had Japan's Hinomaru flag, and other people had the US flag. And so I think it just represents the complexities and competing ideologies that existed in 1960 Okinawa. And so Fukikyo wanted to maintain a separate partisan front to have reversion, but in the late 1960s they really had to make a choice to position themselves toward the American military presence against the backdrop of gruesome GI crimes that I discussed too. So conflicts between progressives and conservatives became very deep in that era. And yes, and it still exists. There was a question about the influence of base economy on Okinawa in the past and present. There is this movement called All Okinawa. They call for the reduction of military bases. They oppose the construction of the new base in Okinawa. But also conservatives formed this group called Team Okinawa. So they say, so are we not Okinawa? So so the movement is not monolithic, but I think the human rights activism is unique to it's Okinawa. Conservatives also employed human rights activism. So, and that really tells their subaltern status. Yeah, and including late Governor Onaga. I think he really represents the Okinawan conservatives who also employed human rights activism and also demanded Okinawa's economic development.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I feel like I feel so compelled to take on the talk show host persona and say, can we have you back again sometime? Because this is a really wonderful conversation for me, and I hope for all the listeners and for our speakers as well. Dr. Inoue, thank you so much for sharing with us your research and your insights into civil society in Okinawa. I'm really looking forward. I want to give you all the encouragement I can to have your dissertation published as a book, and continue publishing the articles that you've done. Go to the Asia Pacific Journal Japan Focus to see some of her work, please. Since I believe I'm going to be in Kyoto next year for at least part of the time, if you're still there, I look forward to getting together with you. And Professor Mochizuki, thank you so much for all of your insights here and your generosity of time. I'm really looking forward to your work as well. I read your essay in that. Is the volume that you edited with Daching Young, is that your most recent book publication or one of the most? You're muted. You're muted, Mike.
Yes, that book is one of my more recent publications as part of the Memory and Reconciliation project. But I've also been working on Japan's nuclear policy, and that's why I've really gotten into the the secret agreement on nuclear weapons.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And to everybody, I want to, again, thank you all for joining us tonight. And just want to say that, you know, as a public humanities project at a public university, the Okinawa Memories Initiative runs on a combination of grants, volunteerism, and donations from the public. The vast majority of our budget goes to support students, graduates, and undergraduates in their work for the project, with fellowships and subsidizing the cost of field research in Okinawa and the United States. The past couple of years of pandemic have kept us grounded, but one of the most exciting things that we've done in the past years is take groups of students with teams of professionals to Okinawa to work with colleagues in Okinawa and to talk with the general public there, engage with them. And we are looking forward to the day when visas are easy and airplanes are cheap. That latter one may never happen. But anyway, in turn, our students and our staff learn the history of Okinawa and the people whose lives are linked to the island through an ethos of community service. We work with partners in Okinawa and members of the Okinawan diaspora to record the history of Okinawa and to amplify its people's voices. So if you're moved to support our project, please consider making a donation at our website, okinawamemories.org. Just click on the giving link in the upper right corner of the page. And thank you so much for joining us for this conversation tonight. And thank you for your support at whatever level you feel comfortable, monetary or simply spiritual. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.